Right, Marty, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I've had the pleasure of speaking with you before. We were able to connect and got a really good understanding of where you come from, where in terms of how you approach leadership. And the reason why we're having this conversation is because I'm fascinated around how people are taking, and I mentioned this to you before as well, read some of Jocko Willink's work in the Navy SEALs, some of the experience you're able to get, and then bring it forward into more the corporate side, but just leadership in general. And I'm sure we'll get into that. I do want to give you an opportunity before we jump into our conversation to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, what's brought you here, and who you are.
Okay. First, thanks for having me. Good to see you again. My story is complicated in that I've jumped around to a lot of different professions, but I started out as a 17-year-old in Nebraska that joined the Navy, and I ended up being talked into volunteering for the SEAL program. So I completed that and showed up at my first SEAL team. I think I was about just shy of 19 years old, and I was in the SEAL teams for 20 years. I did half of that time as an enlisted SEAL and the second half as an officer in the SEAL teams. I had some combat experience during that period. And when I got out, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. A friend of mine talked me out of it. So I went into financial services, first with a company called Legg Mason, then with the United Bank of Switzerland as a portfolio manager. So completely different than carrying a gun around or jumping out of an airplane at 25,000 feet. And then 9/11 happened, and I sold my practice, my portfolio, and everything to another guy at UBS. And I went off and started helping the US government, basically threat analysis and threat profiling, and they were like anticipatory actions rather than actual intelligence. What would you do if you were the bad guys? And then how could people use that information and plan off of it? Because basically, SEALs are trained to be the equivalent of bad guys or terrorists if you think about the tactics that we use. We sneak in, we surprise people, stealth, all that kind of stuff. I went to work for a large government contracting company, and then I went into another small company, very small company, as an equity owner, and we grew that considerably in a very short period of time, in about 4 years, from like 6 million to 34, 35 million a year. We sold it to the employees. The private equity guys asked me to stay on, and I ran that company, bought another healthcare company, eventually expanded over the next 4, 5, 6 years into two health related companies and three government contracting training companies. And I was sitting at the management holding group as the CEO. And now we've spun all those out except for the healthcare company. And so my day job is CEO of the healthcare company. And aside from that, I write books and I do motivational speaking.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that, Marty. I appreciate it. One of the things that jumped out to me, and I do want to explore this with you, especially in your story, you're managing this portfolio. I would assume things are pretty comfortable. And then all of a sudden, to your point, 9/11 happens and you decide to get involved with the government. Was there a bit of friction there thinking, first of all, why would I leave this? I'm assuming, again, comfortable job, go into something that is a bit more chaotic, a lot of unknown. And what motivated you to make that jump?
From the financial services.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. That job is like starting up your own consulting business. They basically take you, it doesn't matter what your age is, they treat you like somebody who's brand new out of college. They put you in a cubicle. Back in those days, they'd give you a phone book and say, start dialing for dollars, start finding clients. And you either make it or you die quick. You're only paid, you don't get a salary, you're only paid based on your sales. You build it up to the point where if you're any good at it, you stick around. And if you start getting referral flows to where your real problem is managing who you bring on board, and you start to create a team, which I did. And I think what happened when 9/11 happened, I was actually in a regional manager's office that morning, and he had a TV on with no sound behind me, and he saw the first plane hit. And when the second plane hit, I instinctively knew exactly what was happening, right? And I had a long drive. I had about a 45 minute to an hour drive back to where I lived, and I had a lot of soul searching. So I was spending, at that point, I'd spent almost 8 years making people wealthy. And at the time, and I was paid well for it. And at the time, that seemed like a very noble effort. I was raising kids. I was getting ready to send them all to college and everything. But for some reason, in that 45 minutes to an hour, it felt kind of lame. And because in the back of my mind, I knew exactly what not just SEALs, but Green Berets, Marines, everybody, what they were going to be doing for the next 48 to 72 hours. I could see it in my head. I'd been a part of that before. So I had 80% disability coming out, mostly from a parachute accident. So I knew I wasn't going to be able to go back into uniform. And I thought, well, is there some other way I can contribute? Is there some way I can get involved? And it turned out that somebody actually reached out to me to give some consulting advice to the Department of Defense. And the more I did that, and they connected me with another group that needed something, I said, I can contribute this way. So to me, it wasn't, I'd built the business. It was really sound. I was doing managed money, so I didn't have to run around trying to find people off the street. But at the same time, both the challenges of the early years had gone away, thank God. But then there's a little bit of a boredom in that you get the system down and you've got everybody on a financial investment plan and things are clicking. So unless something bad happens in the market and you have to talk people off the ledge, now you're like a grand therapist instead of the sales guy. And that to me seemed not only lame from the purpose of it, the greater purpose of it, but I was also probably somewhere in the back of my mind getting a little bored with the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I felt it was noble to be doing what I started to do, which was to help the U.S. government and infrastructure protection and a lot of other things like that. And so it wasn't that hard. I didn't feel like I was jumping into chaos. I felt like I was jumping kind of back into my old job, at least mentally. And I was able to take all that knowledge and all that training experience that the government, that the citizens paid for in that 20-year period, bring it back up and reapply it. And yeah, so for a period there, that was actually very rewarding. And I was happy to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can definitely relate to that piece around, as you mentioned, when you were driving home that day, not finding that work purposeful anymore, right? Like at the time when you started, it served a purpose. But then as this situation is happening in your country, looking at, I feel like I can do more. So I can definitely relate to that calling within oneself. And it sounds like you definitely listen to it. But there's another piece you touched on was helping the government manage or navigate situations where they could be potentially viewed as the bad guy. How do you navigate that piece in general? Because even in the world we live in today, whenever there's war involved, there's never, I'm of the view, and a lot of people will say this, there's never really one side that is right. And you can make that case. But how do you then, on a global scale, what do you do to mitigate that? And to your point, even some of the work that's required or involved, you almost have to think like the enemy. So how do you get to that point? I'm just curious to understand.
So this is going to seem counterintuitive to people's opinions about SEALs or any other special ops person. But so to get into those programs, you have to have a high IQ and a high level of creativity and a lot of psychological resilience. That's a prerequisite, right? So sometimes it gets intellectual. Sometimes people sit there and debate intellectually. But if you asked any of them, why you do what you do, and you go beyond the God and country, that kind of thing, it comes down to you see yourselves as a highly trained, perfectly positioned bodyguard. And most of the jobs that the special operations gets, one way or the other, they're either rescues or they're trying to stop people that are about to blow a bunch of people up, and they have a track record of killing people and blowing people up. So you're either intervening to prevent any more of that happening, or you're taking somebody off the street that's been planning on doing that and has already done that. So you're also intervening and kind of cauterizing that, hopefully. And in the case of rescues, you are trying to go in and save people's lives. So that's really the gut feeling that, because you also have to have something that deep to realize and be okay with putting your life on the line. Because you're not really putting your life on the line for the flag per se. You're not really putting your life on the line for an anthem or anything like that. You're putting your life on the line first because you feel like you have an obligation to the guys around you and they have an obligation to you. So you know that. So that's kind of like the short range obligation. But then the next thing is, how can we stop a bad guy from hurting people? And there's not a whole lot of discussion about what defines the people, because usually we aren't sent to rescue people from other countries and all that. It's usually an American or an American ally or something like that. So you feel pretty good, you feel pretty clean about the mission task, and you want to bring everybody back that went in with you, and you want to get the job done because it's usually helping, saving, or stopping somebody from hurting somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Real basic, not real complicated, but that's what kind of comes down to.
absolutely. Yeah. I appreciate you building on that. Now, let's come back to the leadership piece because that's something you touched on in your own growth and how you've been able to move through different opportunities. What are, and this is something you and I had also covered and chatted about, what are the fundamental differences and commonalities when you're looking at leadership from the Navy SEALs perspective and then trying to replicate that in perhaps an organizational setting or a corporate setting? What are some of the things that you see that are common and some of the things that perhaps a bit more different and nuanced?
So we've already mentioned a couple of things that are clearly different. So there's an altruistic individual mission statement
Mhm.
to make sure nobody around you has to carry your weight or nobody else has to be concerned about you letting them down, and vice versa, right? In the SEAL teams, they call it the brotherhood. The second thing is that you've got this altruistic mission that you're going to go and do something that may be worth your life. And since all of you have decided to follow the same commitment, you all know that's what you're putting on the line, which is weird when you look at the calculus of you send 10 people in to rescue two people and you rescue the two people, but one of yours died.
Yeah.
But that's not the way we look at it. We look at it like a firefighter. A firefighter is going in there, not trying to work the odds on how many firefighters might survive, but they're trying to get innocent people out of the fire. You don't see any of that in the outside unless it's firefighting, EMS, some law enforcement. That is not a character trait in the regular world. In the regular world, the mission is to get whatever you have to get done, hopefully be happy what you're doing professionally, and have enough money to pay your bills, maybe a little bit left over to do something fun. So it'd be absolutely abnormal in a special operations unit for people to jump in their car at 5 minutes to 5 o'clock in the evening, and you'd hear a big roar like NASCAR, and everybody leaves the parking lot. You would instead have people walking around seeing if anybody needs any help with anything, or if there's projects that haven't been completed, work into the night, order pizza, whatever. But it's a mission focus, and if it has to get done within a timeline, everybody commits. And if they're overwhelmed, other people jump in. They solicit, do you need us? Can we help in any way? Even if it's just go get pizza, right?
Yeah.
That's a very rare atmosphere in the commercial world or in regular government.
Yeah.
And that's not a slight, that's just the way people are designed. They're working for their families, they're working for themselves. They've got a certain set of objectives, and it's mission focused, but it's a different kind of mission. And that's probably the biggest difference. The second major difference is the quality of the people.
Mhm.
When you're in the SEALs, especially, it's $2 to $3 million, depending on which quote you want to hear, that it takes to select and train somebody until they're fully qualified as a SEAL. Per SEAL. How much money do people put in their employees in a company? Or how much money has been put into those employees prior to them showing up and working for your company?
Yeah.
I bet you if they'd been working for 40 years and they showed up at your company on day one, they still didn't have $2 million or $3 million worth of training and mentoring and coaching baked into them. So what you're getting is you're getting a highly selected, highly screened group of people. And part of the screening is the IQ and the resilience, the emotional IQ also, they're very mature. So they don't overreact. And that isn't happening on the commercial side. The other thing is the system is set up to replace those kinds of people for you. So if I have a guy named Bob and he's an expert in outboard motors and he breaks his ankle and we're getting ready to go someplace, I go down the hallway and I knock on the door and I tell the operations officer, I just lost my outboard motor expert. And he goes, okay. And he gives me another one just like him. So you never have to think about
Right.
looking for talent, searching for talent, not even really vetting talent, because by the time you're in charge of a civilian, it's all being done for you. Of course, in the outside world, that's not the way it is. The outside world is you lose Bob, you're in trouble. So unless you have a whole bunch of Bobs that you somehow either you got extra Bobs or you've prepared for this and you've been pre-recruiting, you're starting in a cold start and you're looking for a guy like Bob or a woman like Bob, and then you got to go through the whole process of meeting strangers and shaking hands with strangers, and do you believe what they say they can do? And then you end up getting a replacement eventually. But meanwhile, the organization suffers, the business suffers, maybe a project or momentum suffers, and then you have training and onboarding, which is time consuming.
Yeah.
So that's the second biggest thing. Where do you get them from? How fast you get them, and the quality of them, and then what happens if one drops out?
Right.
How do you replace them?
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm really hearing there is there's a talent pipeline, right? So you're not really slowing things down. If, to your point, someone gets hurt or they're unavailable, you can easily fill someone else to come in and fill that role. Now, do you feel like that aspect of altruism that's missing in the outside world? How does one then find it in other parts of their life? Like to your point, again, going back to that experience of driving home after seeing all the stuff that was happening on 9/11, there's an, again, altruistic part of you that wanted to go do more for the government. So how does one find that? Because not everyone has that opportunity. But I do agree with you. When you're working in an organization, you don't get that mission. So then how do you fill that gap for yourself?
Well, there's two ways. One is, if that's important to you, to have a passion or altruistic end game, end state, something that you're participating in, it has a greater value than just the paycheck. There are organizations out there that have mission statements. There are organizations, they may not be your normal commercial stock on NASDAQ kind of a company, but there's lots and lots and lots of organizations, nonprofits that hire people, and even some for-profits that have missions. And there's lots of good examples, but there are not a lot of them. So that's one thing. You could migrate to an organization or a company that does have
Mhm.
a mission statement and truly believes in it, and they have an altruistic outcome, and it's not just about the money. The second thing is, and this is what I tell a lot of military people transitioning out of the military. I told my own son when he joined the Air Force a long time ago, he wanted to be a NASCAR driver, or at least in a pit crew, but then he joined the Air Force and he loved racing cars. And I said, why can't you race cars while you're in the Air Force? Why do you have to have one option for your life? So he gets stationed out in Utah after he goes through his preliminary training for about 8 or 9 months. And he goes out and he buys one of those old Fast and Furious cars, puts some nitrous oxide in it, and starts doing track racing. And he's happier in the clan, right?
Yeah.
So that's what he's doing on his weekends. He's hanging out with guys that are doing that. And during the week, he's an Air Force satellite communications expert. There's no conflict there. He basically got what he wanted as far as a paycheck and all that. And that's the model I would tell somebody, and answer your question. If your profession is such that you really can't find anybody that's going to be having an altruistic culture, then fine. That becomes the revenue stream. Nothing more passionate than that.
Right.
Go volunteer in an organization that does have that kind of targeted outcome. Create something yourself that you can have fun with. You can start a business, you can start a hobby, or you can do like my son did, just do amateur stuff, amateur racing, amateur martial arts, amateur artwork. You'd be engaged, and you'd probably be happier for being engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other piece is just being very honest with yourself too, that, hey, this is just a job that's bringing in income, but I can find other fulfilling things, to your point, just being honest about that too. Because I think a lot of people fall into that trap of deceiving themselves that, hey, this job can mean more, it can have more purpose, but it may not be the case.
Yeah, I know a guy who's at a Toyota dealership. He's been there for the last 11 years, and he's in the service department, but he's not in the garage. He's in the interaction with the customers. And I was talking to him about a month ago. Didn't know this about him, but I mentioned something, and he said that he was an amateur car guy. And so he whips out his phone, starts showing me all these rebuilds, and he basically shows refurbished cars and trucks, and he goes on the show circuit. He's got 2 or 3, buys them, builds them up so that they're his babies, and then he takes them on the circuit until he's bored with that. Then he sells them at a profit, goes out and buys another hunk of junk, whatever, and then does the same thing all over again. And if you could see the difference in how he interacted, talked to me about that,
Yeah.
compared to the way he'd been talking to me for 10 years, which was his formal business kind of, yeah, that's where his heart was.
Right.
And he was making a little bit of money, and he was spending his free time away from the revenue stream,
Yeah.
having a blast.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that. Now, building on the leadership side, so what are some of the things that you are preaching when you're trying to help have that culture of leadership within the organizations? And one of the things you touched on was accountability. How does accountability show up? And how do you ensure that's maintained within that culture of the organization?
So you mentioned Jocko.
Yeah.
I was his instructor when he came through the selection course. So that's how I first met him. And he focuses a lot on accountability. And I think he puts it pretty well. You can't dodge his definition. Basically, you're responsible. Full stop.
Yeah.
So you're responsible for your actions, you're responsible for your inaction. So if you buy into an organization, which means you've said, I will do the job, I will join you, I will do what you ask me to do, I will help whatever the goal is. You've taken on the accountability of that action because you behaved in a way that everybody's now thinking you're committed to this thing. So every decision you make and every decision you don't make, or every decision you dodge, or every hard truth you don't speak is your responsibility. So that's the real core accountability. And that's how it is in the SEAL teams. At least that's what we would try to aspire to, because nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect, but if you hold yourself to that kind of a standard and you're in a special operations unit, then basically every day we would get up, we were doing a self-inventory. What am I weak in? What am I moderately proficient in? And what am I strong in? So what I need to do is create a day where if the command is not doing it, I'll do it myself. I have to sustain the things that I'm good in, try to improve the things I'm moderately good in, and really fix whatever I'm not good in. And I owe it to myself, but I also owe it to everybody around me. I'm accountable for my own state, my own ability to behave and execute. And it's not somebody else's. It's not the training department's responsibility. It's not the guy in charge of the command. I'm not going to sit back and wait for somebody to lead me by the hand and say, oh, I will mentor and coach you. No, we would always say it's my personal responsibility. Going back to what I said earlier, because we felt that one of our missions, one of our, motivations was to make sure that the guys around us could trust us, lean on us, and know that we would do our job.
Yeah.
That is actually something you can achieve outside of the military. The learning curve, the difficulty is the learning curve. And I've had lots of different companies. I've been in charge of lots of different groups and divisions in companies. If you inherit the company as a leader, you have to go around and get your sense all the way from the lowest level employee doing the most menial task, which is where I would start, all the way up until you get to the people that are going to be reporting directly to you. And what you do is you get a sense of the culture without firing questions and stuff, just asking in general, what do you do? How long you been here? But you can get a sense of, are they happy? Are they unhappy? Are they motivated? And are they worried? Are they scared? They're not talking. You can pick up a line, make notes, and eventually you get to your direct reports and you ask them some of the same questions. And right off the bat, if you see a complete separation of the reality of one layer to the reality of another layer, then these people are not in tune. They have why? Is it because they don't think the people below them and the information that they have and the reality that they're aware of is worthy of their time and worthy of their interest? Sometimes that's it. It's more of a caste system. But at that point, you can bring those people into a room and say, hey, guess what I learned? Without pointing names at anybody, you don't want anybody in any heat on them, but why don't you guys know this? How come none of you guys talk to me about any of this? So I want you guys to go and I want you to sit down with your group, your team, and I want you to have a little mini town hall and say, look, I just want to hear what your thoughts are. It could be you want to change the paint on the walls. I don't care what it is. A free-for-all. And then you shut up and take notes. No comments, no interactions, no interventions, no guidance. Just let them all start talking. Because if you do that, it'll be slow, but eventually the pot will start boiling and boom, and you'll have a hard time keeping up.
Yeah.
And then I want you all to do that within the next 2 months. Then I want you to come back and we'll share what you've learned. Because you're going to have the same experience I did. You're going to learn things you don't know, but you're going to have much, much more detail about things that I didn't hear because I wasn't sitting with them very long. That's the beginning of breaking the mistrust, the powers at the top versus the workers at the bottom. Because then, if you can break through that, then the communication is valid and candid, and therefore informative and valuable to everybody. And that kind of shortens the learning curve. It gets everybody in the same kind of brain space. And if it's a bad situation, then everybody knows it's a bad situation. So then you figure out how to solve the problem, whatever the problem is or problems. If it's a good situation, then everybody knows it's a good situation. What you haven't really created a culture. What you've created is the first step, which is the ability to have a conversation, communicate, exchange information in a trusting way, and be candid without any concern of retribution by anybody. That's what I try to do every time I first step into any organization. The second thing, while that's going on, I start telling the direct reports, there's a new sheriff in town. We're going to hire a little bit differently. And then I start looking at, have they given anybody bonuses? What's their training budget look like? Nowadays, there's almost nothing. The training budget will be zero, even in really big companies, right? Which 25, 30 years ago, all companies train their people. So in the military, you train everybody because they're going to eventually be your replacement. You train them in their specific skill area, but you also train them in general leadership. Because not metaphorically, but actually, if an Army squad's running up to charge a machine gun nest and the officer in charge gets killed, the sergeant takes over. And it keeps on going down. Everybody knows what their job is as a leader because they're taught that all the way from the day they come through the pipeline. That isn't taught in companies. Nobody feels like they have leadership responsibilities below a certain title.
Yeah.
That's bad because the rest of the people don't have their eyes and ears on. They're not looking for things. They're not looking for threats and risks or obstacles or opportunities. So you're only as smart and you're only as aware as the top little cluster of people could possibly be.
Right. Yeah.
So those are ways you can change the communications leading to a change in the culture and then start really leveraging the brain power of an organization.
For sure. And what I'm hearing from you is really that culture, especially around accountability, coming back to that piece, starts from the top and works its way down. And to show that accountability, again, it's taking that responsibility, but then also taking responsibility for the consequences that come with some of your decisions. And unfortunately, at least in my experience, I don't see that. I don't see that level of accountability, even starting at the top of the chain or leadership. And then there's not a whole lot of responsibility being taken as well, because then there's always a scapegoat. I don't know if that's something you've experienced, and how do you manage against that?
Yeah. Some of my friends think it's funny, but there's a rule in the Navy. If the ship runs aground or runs into another ship, the captain's fired. Doesn't matter if the captain was ashore in a hotel room. Doesn't matter if the captain was asleep downstairs. They don't hold the people that were steering the ship.
Yeah.
They hold the person in charge of the ship. They fire him. And you see it on the news all the time.
Yeah.
So-and-so was relieved of his command. It just happened like 2 weeks ago. A carrier ran into some commercial ship and within a day, captain. So the Navy's version of accountability is that you've given somebody all the lives that are on that ship. And they are responsible not just for EBITDA or total gross revenue this year, whatever. They're responsible for the lives of 100, 300, 3,000 people, depending on the size of the ship. And they've learned over time, you can't be tolerant of failure in that position because all it takes is one moment of failure and lots of people pay the price. And that goes back to the British Navy too, way back. That was their rule. Unfortunately, and I think a lot of this was similar in the United States anyway, prior to probably the 1970s. There was a lot more ex-military people from World War I, World War II in business and in leadership positions who held the same thing. Hey, and in the military, it's not we hate your guts, you're fired. It's, hey, you know what we got to do, but I wish you all the best kind of fired.
Right.
So it was never done with any kind of malice. And therefore, it was done fairly frequently. And you could probably go get a job someplace else, especially if they knew what happened and, okay, they give you a smaller ship or something, metaphorically. But what happened in the 70s for some reason is leadership became more of an entitlement in a lot of organizations. And the position itself became like a protected entitlement. And then later on, for the same reasons when I mentioned about trying to find Bob, how difficult it is, imagine trying to find Bob if Bob is somebody who's in charge of IBM or Microsoft and he leaves. So the mistake of hiring the wrong replacement could be catastrophic. Or so what you do is you let Bob hang out for a while. You dodge the transition succession risk by mitigating it and stretching Bob out. Oh, the board will watch over Bob, make sure Bob doesn't do it. Meanwhile, everybody below Bob say Bob hasn't changed. He's still making the same stupid decisions. And then people start leaving because if you don't hold leaders accountable, eventually people below them say, I don't trust the integrity of the organization. And especially if they're in a position to actually keep offering new ideas, new insights, different paradigms, whatever, and they're just being snuffed and snubbed. And
Yeah.
so they walk. So you start hollowing out your best and brightest because the system, the institution doesn't want to go through the pain of finding another General Eisenhower or something. And that became the norm into the 80s and 90s. And to this day, I don't think there's a lot of companies that will automatically decide that the first thing we do is get rid of the CEO or the president.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, that probably is a good transition into hiring, right? So that's something we talked about. So then what are some things that you keep at the forefront when you're hiring, especially in the leadership space? We talked about accountability, but what are some other factors that you place as a priority when you're seeking to hire leaders in various organizations? Like, what are some things people should be aware of?
So this is going to sound silly, but if you were running a professional football team, would you entertain recruiting and interviewing basketball and hockey players? They're sports athletes, they're professionals,
Yeah.
right? They can probably do meet a lot of the different metrics as far as speed and strength and all that. The reason you don't do that is because NFL football is a very specific game requiring very specific capabilities and skills. And you're not just hiring any old athlete in. So companies never really think about what is the specific culture, the specific type of profile we want in here. What they do is they're a football team and they're hiring hockey players because on the resume, it looks like they play sports. So bring it back to the real world. If you want, like we were talking about before, if you want to create a culture, it's harder to transform the culture than it is to build it. But you have to do both simultaneously. If you end up being put in charge of a group and you have the authority to kind of mold it and start working, do the things I said earlier, but you have to go right to that front door with HR and say, okay, this is what we're going to do different. You're going to sit with me and I'm going to explain the kind of person we want here, the kind of professional we want here. And I'm going to talk about a lot of things that don't have anything to do with their technical resume. And people call are they a good fit? I'll tell you, 99% of the time, if you've been looking for Bob for a while and you're freaking out because you really need to get Bob in there, that fit thing is, yeah, he's a good fit. As long as the resume has everything that Bob had in his resume, get him in the seat and get him working because we're falling behind. And I've seen it in my organizations, even when I said you can't do that. So you basically have to create a profile, a cultural profile of the characteristics and attributes you're looking for in a human being. What I've found is for the kind of groups that I like to run, you need to find somebody who is open-minded, not closed-minded. You need to find somebody who's okay working with other people in teams and projects. Now, teams is a generic term tossed out there, but project everybody gets, right? So if you're an accountant and you're used to sitting in a cubicle and doing exactly what your stack of work is and then punching out, and I say, would you be comfortable working with a project team, say working on some price refinements on one of our products, and they look at you like they're freaking out, they are not going to be the kind of person that's going to be adaptable. And therefore, they're probably hampered communication skills, interpersonal skills, even though their resume says they're great. Clinically, they're great. HR hates that because the clinical great person is exactly what they are used to. That's the round peg in the round hole. But you're not trying to get a round peg in a round hole. You're trying to get a round peg that will come in and act and operate with everybody else the way your culture is supposed to.
Right.
They don't have to be great communicators, but they should be able to explain themselves a little bit and be comfortable doing that. Because if they're very stilted and they're introverted, that they can't communicate or express themselves, then they're never going to be candid because they're just not going to talk. So you have to have that ability. And you also have to, there's things like honesty, integrity. You can ask lots of story questions. What would you do in this situation? What would you do in that situation? Describe a situation like this that you might have been in. What did you do? Or describe a situation like that your leaders were in and how did they act? And then they say it. And how did you feel about that? What, did you agree with that? Or, so you can get a sense of their ethics and their integrity. But the easiest part of the hiring process is punching out a job description. And I just reviewed one for a mid-level accountant about an hour ago. You punch the thing out, you find a human being that regurgitates a resume that matches it, if they're smart. You interview them. Are you really? Did you really? Have you really? Did you really? Have you really? Okay, you're in the A block. And then you keep going. You go, we've only got one in the A block, and we've got 3 that I don't think we'd hire, and we're running out of time. So you hire the one in the A block because they matched up. Clinically. Yeah. So it takes a lot of guts to do it because you are going to delay and drag it a little bit. And you have to intervene with the HR professionals because unless they've done this before, they will always default back to the mean and do it their way because they feel their job is to fill a position. And if there's anybody between you and them, you got to make sure those leaders know that's what your intention is. And you can even sit in on the interview process. And I catch HR not actually doing the profile part.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's how I think you set the tone and you establish good input practices. And you have, are they all be perfect? No. But what you end up with is you have a much higher probability over a period of time because what you're doing is you're adding in the right color food dye to what you're already trying to develop internally. And it may even accelerate you getting to wherever you think the end state of the culture building should be.
Yeah. And I'm curious to understand from your perspective. Now, if you're trying to build a specific culture, so you brought in someone in the leadership level that perhaps comes from a different background and different culture themselves, but the rest of the organization isn't built around that culture. Like, how do you navigate that conflict? Because I've seen that take place where then the leaders trying to influence the culture they're familiar with into the rest of the organization. There's a lot of pushback or morale changes amongst the people. So then how do you navigate that piece, especially if people don't fit into that new culture?
Well, if you're an owner or a board, you have the same set of responsibilities I just laid out in hiring the top person.
Yeah.
So you have to think about what are you trying to achieve in publicly traded companies, and this has been around forever. You could find it in articles, et cetera. If a corporation is doing really well and the senior person decides to retire, it would be insane for the board to put in a maverick disruptor because everything's going great.
Yeah.
And all a maverick disruptor will do is destroy the damn thing. They're going to take the family car and drive it like it's a NASCAR car and run into a tree because that's all they like. That's what they like to do. It's their nature. The opposite also, if you need a company, you have a company that's in trouble or needs to be disrupted. It's been sitting in its own, stewing its own juices. It hasn't really reacted to changes in the marketplace. Their products are getting obsolete. There's no zest to try to do anything. That's when you put the disruptor in, right? If you put a maintenance person in charge of that, they're going to maintain that dysfunctional arrangement, right? So there are also nuances to that in bigger companies. They think they're going to sell a company, they bring in somebody that has some knowledge of building a company's value for 24, 36 months prior to going to market or going public or things like that. And there are people with specific skills like that. So they at least have, at a minimum, have to have that in their resume. They've done that before. But if you are trying to build a company's value in any way, shape, or form, some of the disruption element of a leader's, I guess, impact is going to shake somebody out who doesn't agree with what's happening, unless the leader does absolutely nothing, like that maintenance scenario. So there's kind of two black and white extremes. The one is the stagnant company. Everybody's been sitting there. Everybody's been tenured. People have been there for 21 years. All the competitors are eating their lunch. Their market share has been shrinking nonstop for the last seven years. The competitors are all gone to a mixed hybrid, brick and mortar, online kind of model. You stuck with brick and mortar, and somebody comes in and says, "We got to change some things." Now, the people in that company, unless they've been trained and educated on business dynamics and business models and market analysis, they're not going to see any value in that, and they're not going to see any logic in that. It's just going to feel like somebody's doing something to me.
Right.
That's unfortunate, but that's true. Now, you can come in as a disruptor and communicate what's going on. But a part of the communication is you got to change in a more dramatic way.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's going to perceive that they're the one on the chopping block. So inadvertently, you might be fleshing out good and bad people just because it is what it is.
Right.
If you keep it a secret and then they find out, then everybody's going to assume the very worst case and you'll lose even more people, right? So that's a very delicate situation. The other extreme is where you've got a very, think like a Silicon Valley scenario. You got a very vibrant, interactive, intellectually competitive group of people. And you put some stick in the mud professor type at the top who tries to lock everything down, turn everything into a process, have meetings for everything, stratify the matrix organization of thought, take all the whiteboards off the hallways so that we can collaborate on the fly, all that kind of stuff, because they like things in control and locked down. And those people will leave.
Yeah.
For a different reason, but they will leave because it's not compatible with what makes them happy and feeling safe and fulfilled. So it's a hard thing to do, but making that choice of who you put in charge. I screwed up a couple of years ago. My board, me, we all screwed up. We hired a guy, and he said all the right things. Took 9 people interviewing, talking with them, some social events and everything. And his reality was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
Lasted a year, but the damage was done. Worst hire I ever did in 20 plus years in business. And I played that thing back 100 times and we all got snookered.
Yeah.
He was charming and he was articulate and he knew how to put us at ease. And so everybody's going to make a mistake at some point. Hopefully you don't make a mistake like that with the number one person.
Right.
But yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's always a challenge, but you can start with understanding your business, understanding what the organization is supposed to do, opening up the communications and trying to match the attributes, characteristics, and kind of personality profiles to what the culture needs to be.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing that you touched on, because that was something I was going to ask you too, is how do you come back from those decisions where looking back, probably not the right decision? And to your point, there can be people that are Machiavellian in nature or charming, and they can say all the right things, but then when they're put in that role, it's not coming to fruition. So I think even from that standpoint, as a leader, you have to be able to, coming back to that accountability piece, cut your losses and say, hey, mess this one up. We'll chalk it up to taking it as a lesson, move on, and how do we do it differently? But I think a lot of times people get stuck where they're not willing to admit the mistake because it'll look bad on them. And because that can also happen. So what would you offer in those instances where you've made a poor decision and now you stick it out because you don't want to make it seem like you've made a poor decision?
So accountability doesn't mean you're committed to self-flagellation every time you make a mistake.
Yeah.
It means that you are honest with yourself, that you have the integrity to face what you're going to do and make a decision and own it, or face what you did decide to do and own the results. So learning from failure is the only way you're going to get ahead in life anyway. So I kept talking about honesty and candor and integrity. This is for everybody, not just the leaders.
Yes.
It starts with leaders, I think, in a lot of ways. You can have a leader that's all these things we think a leader should be, And there could be a layer under the leader that are exactly the opposite. They're holding back information. They're passing up misinformation. They're treating their people poorly, lying about how they're treating their people. And in those organizations, it's harder for the top leader to get down to the truth. Unless you do what I said before, you walk around a little bit. And if you feel like you're still not being told the truth, you need to do that on a regular basis so that the people are comfortable with you walking by, shooting the breeze with them, whatever. And you get to where you can walk through and you can see by body language who's happy, who's unhappy. And it may be a personal issue, but you can tell once you've seen them a couple of times. But we're all human, we're all fallible. In the military, I didn't have a chance to hire people. They were always assigned to me, right? So there, the accountability was, did I fail them in leading them or grooming them or preparing them for the current situation or their next situation? Because that's part of you're constantly grooming everybody around you for their next job, even though you're not going to be around.
Right.
That's one of your leader tasks. Mm-hmm. But if you make mistakes, and I probably, in the commercial world, I probably hired directly or indirectly at least 600-700 people, and out of thousands, but ones that I actually had my hands on somehow. And I'd say I probably made about 13 or 14 errors in judgment, more in the early years. Mm-hmm. And then I think the last one was the one I mentioned earlier, and it's been 3 or 4 years. The other problem is holding on to people too long.
Yeah.
Right? The enabling issue, which anybody coming out of the military, that's their Achilles heel, because you are, like I said before, your job is to train, prep, and keep fixing and correcting and getting people stronger and stronger. And in the commercial life, you've got somebody that just isn't, and you just grind yourself into the ground trying to figure out ways to help them. And then you never let them go. And everybody around it can be going, well, let's go. And people might even want to quit. I've had, in the early days, I had people say, I'm going to quit if we don't do something about that person. We've been trying to train that person. And yeah, but they're not doing it. Right. And so I finally got out of it, got more objective. But then I had leaders below me. I saw them doing it, ex-military guys for the most part. And then I'd have to set them aside and say, you're helping them. You're helping them not perform. And maybe this just isn't the right place for them. And that's not being candid if I keep telling you, all we got to do is go out and shoot a few more baskets and you're going to be in the NCAA.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's a good point too. Marty, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate everything you've shared. Lots of insight and wisdom, not only from your personal experience, but even some of the things you've observed being in business for so long. I know we've touched on a lot of things, but is there anything else you feel like we haven't covered and it would be of value to touch on in terms of leadership or finding that commonality between the Navy and then working in the business side? If there's anything else you would like to add?
I think that there's a distinct difference between leadership and management. I think it's been muddied, especially by the B schools, and everybody just picked up on it, that management equals leadership. It doesn't. If you think of the definition of management as somebody who oversees established processes, systems, and labor, who are doing what they've been assigned to do because of what they're qualified to do. And if something goes wrong, they know how to fix it. They have an instruction guide, they have a diagnostic tool, whatever. That's management. Leadership is when one of those processes or systems or people fail in a dramatic way. An example would be you lose your number one sales professional, and it's going to immediately have a hit on your sales number, right? Not only that, they went to your competitor and they took some of your clients with you. So you manage your way out of that. You're not going to pull a guidebook up. You're not going to find something. You're not going to go to ChatGPT or Grok, whatever, and go, how do I deal with the fact that you have to be emotionally prepared for that, to step up and think it through, ask for advice from everybody, and then figure out a corrective action. And that doesn't mean you by yourself, but bring all the brain cells you possibly can. If you understand that that's what leadership is, it's not the day-to-day making sure the snow cone machine's working.
Right.
Leadership is dealing with the things that go wrong. You lose your main supplier, your number one client just cut you off. That's where you have to step up and be what's truly and historically been known as leader. So if you keep those distinctions separate, then the next thing is, have I been acting like a manager? Have I always been a manager? And how do I learn to be a leader? How do I learn to prepare myself for the moment where leadership is needed? Because you can be the same person and have both capabilities, but you can't pretend that management is leadership.
Yeah. Yes. No, that's definitely an important distinction as well. So thank you for sharing that. Now, for listeners that want to find more about you or your work, what are some ways they can do that? Whether it's a link or online, how would they do that?
Sure, the easiest thing is just to go to martystrong.com. So I've got access to all my speaking programs, all my books. I've got 9 novels and 3 business books. And so it's all right there. A lot of articles are on there. I'm on LinkedIn also. It's pretty easy to find me. All my articles are posted on LinkedIn also.
All right. That's great. We'll put that in the show notes. But thank you again, Marty. Appreciate your time today and coming on the show.
All right. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.